staring at the sky. Indeed. I wonder what they saw. The artwork of the Ascension is pretty predictable. Usually there's a crowd of people somewhere on a hillside, and Jesus is kind of taking off, and there's a cloud above him, and some sort of power beneath him, lifting him off the earth itself. My favorite picture, or painting, rendering, if you will, of Ascension is Salvador Dali's. Salvador Dali is one of my favorite artists. I remember in Sunday school, in 8th grade, the Sunday school teacher bringing a painting by Salvador Dali of the Last Supper, with Jesus and the disciples sitting at this pristine white table, and behind them was not the familiar room that we're so used to seeing in paintings by people like Da Vinci, but interstellar space. Well, Dali's idea of what the Ascension looked like to the disciples really is two big feet bottoms, the bottoms of Jesus' feet, going up into the sky with his arms outstretched, just like they were on the cross, as if he's reminding us of the cross, and as if he's saying something about Jesus embracing God as well as the mission that God has given him. How often do we stare into the sky thinking about things when we know there are things to be done? How often do we get caught up in the ethereal, even the ethereal kinds of things that are so much a part of the church? How often are we so lost in our planning that we forget about doing? Maybe we need to remember the words of those two young men who show up and kind of nudge, at least that's how I imagine them, nudging the disciples and saying, "So, what you looking at? Get to work." We have tasks to do. We have a job as people who follow Christ to carry on with the message entrusted to us. And that's where the ears come in. Now, what are the last words of Jesus? If somebody were to come up to you tomorrow in your workplace and say, "You remember Jesus' last words?" You might, if you're a lover of John's Gospel, you might say, "Oh, that's easy. It is finished." Or you might think of the synoptics and say, "I think his last words were, 'Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do.'" That's the way most people would answer that question. But the last words of Jesus are in the Gospel today. Remember, it's not for you to know the times and seasons, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. In other words, if those two young men were standing there going, "Don't stare into the skies, get to work," Jesus is saying, don't worry about things. Don't worry about times and seasons. Don't worry about people like this preacher in California who predicted that the world was coming to an end last month, and now he's moved the date to October. Don't worry about those things. You will receive power. You have been given power by the Spirit. Power to do what? To be a witness to the kingdom. Think of the way that Jesus talks in the gospel today. Think of how Jesus is described